Today I would like to give you some more insights. After we were talking about basics of HTML and CSS last week, this talk is a little bit shorter and it's about separation of concerns. So let's start. First things first, I'm Marc Haunschild. They introduced me already. I'm an accessibility consultant, front-end developer, and I'm a technical writer. And the second slide is not here from last week. I was writing 3 books and they're all in German. You cannot, they're only in German. Okay. They're about HTML, CSS, and accessibility. What a surprise. Okay, today I'm talking a little bit about how we are doing things in the Federal Office of Agriculture and Food, where I'm working as a developer and I'm testing websites if they are accessible and things like this. I'm not saying any insights, everything is just in general. I'm just saying that we are doing these things, and I would like to announce that everything I'm saying here is my own opinion and it's not an official statement of the Federal Office for Agriculture and Food. So it's about separation of concerns, and we are covering a few topics. First of all, I would like to tell you why this is important, why it makes sense to separate the different concerns we have when building websites. There are usually 3 of them. First is the content, which has to be structured and meaningful described, which we call semantics. The second one is the layout, the presentation of the content. And the last one is functionality, how it works, the interactivity. Is there a word like this? In German, you would say something like this. So you can interact with the website, let's say, like this. Then we are talking about the grid. And the reason is because right now frameworks, CSS frameworks are very popular, and I'm trying to show you how to replace them with native CSS. And the reason is why, because they do not separate these concerns. After saying why this is nice to separate these concerns, I'm telling you how to do this in your own code. Then in the third part, framework features, we are talking about not only the grid, but about other features which are coming with popular frameworks, especially Bootstrap, because it's the most popular. And then I'm giving you code examples from how it could look like if you're using native CSS. And last but not least, I'm giving you once again a few more information at the end for, it's a surprise. I'm not saying a lot about this, you will see. Okay, let's start. So what are the use cases and the reasons to consider this concept of separating the concerns? Our use case is that we are using very often for many different tools the same layout. Of course, we have a corporate identity and a lot of other people have. And of course, we want all the time that the things are looking the same and they have always the same corporate design on it. And maybe you think, oh, this is a special use case and I don't have this on my own, but I think you're wrong, because we make websites with Java, with PHP, with different languages, with different tools like Typo 3, and does not matter which tools you are using at all. But I'm quite sure that if you're using a CMS, you have some plugins and maybe your own individual code also, and you already have a lot of components and they all should look the same. And it will become much easier if you have the same code bases. So also for Working with it, we are using code fragments. You know this from atomic design, this philosophy, atoms, molecules, organisms, which you can reuse. And unlike in atomic design, we don't usually use these fragments completely layouted because sometimes they have to look different, and actually this is not a thing, in my opinion, a backend developer should worry about, because the front-end developer should take care that if the HTML is coming out in a form the front-end developer can use it, then the front-end developer has to deal with it. About this also a little bit more later in detail. Okay, so what is separation of concerns good for? I was starting with 3 reasons and I came up with 5. And here I have already 6, and I especially did not change the title anymore. And plus there's even more. So I finally stopped finding reasons because there are more than enough. The most important, I guess, is it makes accessibility easier. And I told you this is one of the most important things to me. It makes progressive enhancement easier. We were talking about this last week, which means you're delivering a website which has as a basic an HTML document which makes sense on its own and does not need the layout for being accessible so everybody can use it. It's keeping things smart and simple, so it's less complicated than other solutions. It now allows specialists to work together in a different way than today. About this, there will be also a little bit more insight later. And it respects the constraints. A lot of technique we are using are trying to push forward the constraints we have in developing things. And actually, this might sound like something good, but yeah, I was listening to one talk in the Beyond Tellerrand conference last year and cannot repeat this everything now, but there is actually beauty in all constraints, which means if you are sitting down and you just accept that some things are not possible and you find your way around, very often really beautiful and nice things happen. So just accept some constraints, and at the last point here, number 6, on the other side, it will free you from unnecessary constraints. We will see what this means also later. You don't have to learn a framework. This is a little bonus. I'm sorry, my printer is starting. I think I'm getting some spam now. Sorry, but this is real life. Okay. So let's start with reusable code, which is really something everybody wants. And the first thing you see here is a typical line of code from, I cannot, sorry, which maybe everybody saw already. So we have a table, an opening tag, and we have a few classes in the table opening tag, table, table striped, and table dark, which is a little bit crazy because I never understood why a table needs the class table. It should already look like a table. And if you need this class, I think something is not good. But anyway, from all these classes, this is the best even because it's semantically correct. You have a table here and you're just writing it in it once more. Then there is table striped and table dark. And this means that you can use this code only for a table that is striped and has a dark design, some kind of dark design. It's implicated here. So if you want to change the tables, and normally all tables in your whole website on every single page have to look the same, you must change it in every place you were writing this classes into. this. I'm so sorry. Last time I was putting it out. Today I forgot it. So next thing, in opposite to the forest example, I can use this next code. I'm even too stupid to know how to make this quiet. Sorry. There are so many buttons on my phone. I hope now he got it. So this is really embarrassing. I'm sorry, but like I said last time, we're all making mistakes, and actually I like to show you that not everything is going right on the side of the experts. They have the same problems like everybody else. So there is nothing like magic happening here. Okay, here in the next time, an example that I consider a good one is you have maybe one class in the table, and this class is describing what is inside the table. So it's a semantic class. It has nothing to do with the presentation. It says in this table, we have a table of contents, which means headlines and page numbers or things like this. In opposite to the first example, you can reuse this anytime when you have a table of contents. You can put it into your site, into your any page, and if you want to change the look and feel of this table, you can change it in one place in your CSS file, and you're done. And you don't have to go to every single table in your page, in your pages. Actually, what's funny, when I started with WordPress, my first WordPress page needed tables, and I was confused because I didn't find how to make them. And I found out that it's only possible with a plugin, which was strange to me because I thought every web page needs a table, but I found out that it's not true. Now I've made a lot of web pages with WordPress, and I have maybe 80% that have not this plugin, because on all these pages there are no tables. But if you're using a framework like Bootstrap, all the CSS for tables comes with it always, and everybody who's visiting your page is downloading it every time. When you're going to a website which uses these frameworks, all the CSS, which is in big parts not necessary, is going to be downloaded. Of course, you can tailor this. You can configure Bootstrap so that it's not happening, but actually most people are not doing it. They are using Bootstrap because it's easy and they don't have to do a lot. And if it's not necessary to tailor it, they just don't. And you end up with really a lot of CSS, what is not necessary. Okay, and normally most tables have to look the same in all the pages you have on the website. And so these things very often are not necessary. Anyway, you want to have them look the same. So this is a little bit of going back to the roots, because these things are, this is HTML, which you should not write anymore because this is from the early days of the web. And when we did not have CSS, you were writing something like big color into the HTML. If you wanted to have a background green and a big font, actually, I'm not even sure if this was right because I was not writing this for a really long time. But something like this you had to write. So every time when you had a paragraph that should look like this, you had to write this. Sometimes 100 times on a web page. And I was doing this, and I was doing this by hand because frameworks and a lot of other things we are using today were not available in this time. And this was no fun at all. So some nice people sat down, intelligent people, clever people, and thought about making things better, and they invented CSS. So in one place, we can change the background color and the font size of all paragraphs. And what we are doing today now, and nobody is asking us, we're doing it ourselves. We are writing once again things into our HTML, which is for presentation. And we're doing what we have done before CSS, and this is really strange. And yeah, here's the result. And this is how it should be. And you can change in one place everything you want. You can make even more complex styling in just seconds, and it will be it will change the presentation of all H1. If you know your HTML, you don't even have to leave the CSS file, because yeah, H1 is H1, you know there it is, and you can change it. The grid. So if you're making web pages with a framework, they look usually something like this. You have a container, you have a row into it, then you have a few columns into it. All of them have classes to control what the behavior of these boxes you have here. And on the other hand, you have clean, very short HTML, and you could use this. It looks like they are not complete, both of them. We're looking on the next page. But here should be one more item. There should be an aside or something like this. Now on the next page also not. I know I had problems with this slide, but I thought I have made this. But on the other hand, here also is not everything. So this would be longer and this would be a little bit longer. And I think it's clear what I want to say here, because you have much less code. One element less, 3 attributes less, I was counting, it's not working here anymore, and 5 lengthy values left, like these things. And besides all these things, you have to learn in addition to CSS. This is not coming for free. So what is this thing doing? Actually, this is just taking these two things and putting them into two columns. One is bigger than the other, and something similar you can get when you have this CSS and here's article and here's a site. And I don't know why this is not here anymore, because I was fixing this. Sorry for this. Just imagine one article, one aside, here one article and an aside missing. And this also should be a little bit longer. But this
Marc,
actually
there was a question from the audience.
Yeah.
Excuse me. What do you mean when writing pages with frameworks? What is a framework? Is the question from the audience.
I thought everybody knows this already, and I'm sorry that I was not saying anything about it. Frameworks is something like Bootstrap. And what you see here is they are providing the CSS that you need to get a responsive layout without knowing CSS. And this is why a lot of people learn this in addition to CSS, because anyway, you need no CSS for changing colors and things like this. And then you must know also these classes, because all these classes do things. This is justify, content, middle. This is for medium screen sizes, and then the content should be in the center. So all these things you have to learn, and then you can write it and use it or copy and paste it from the docs. And then this is establishing a new column. This is a new column, and for large screens, it should be, I'm not very common in this syntax, but because I'm not writing it, so I cannot say anything in detail, but all these things just make that you don't have to make your layout yourself with CSS. You're just using the CSS which is already given. And this is making another problem.
There's another question from the audience. Could you mention names of 1 to 2 more frameworks other than Bootstrap? Sorry.
Yeah, there is Foundation, and I know an older one, 960, was very famous, but I'm not sure if this is at all responsive. But I'm not using it, so maybe you should ask somebody else about this. Okay. We have much more options with CSS Grid in this for making web pages, because there are some constraints to Bootstrap and there are workarounds. I'm going a little bit faster through these things now because I think the point is clear. It's actually, some of these things are possible. For example, boxes over 2 or more rows of the grid. Like you saw before, for every row you make a container and you're putting things in for making 2 columns. And if you want to put one high container and 2 others, you have to make this workaround. So first of all, you need your container, then 1 or more rows. And in one half of this, you're putting a box for content that should be as high as 2 others. And the 2 others you're putting into 1 more container. So really a lot of containers into each other. And with CSS Grid, you need something like this. I think this makes things very obvious. And you can make more things like putting things that overlap. For example, this thing could go like this here with CSS Grid. Sometimes this is useful. Here you cannot go out of this. This is completely clear. You cannot make this thing stretching from here to here. And this is just one line of code in CSS Grid. So actually you have less constraints. Briefly, Bootstrap and all other CSS frameworks do not offer a 2-dimensional grid. 2-dimensional grid means you can put things, you can make them stretch over in this direction and in this direction. Here you have only 1 dimension always where you can place things. This makes things complicated. The HTML needs loads of presentational markups. A lot of things must be nested into each other. And yeah, this is just making things more difficult. And of course, there was a reason not to using it. First of all, nobody wants to learn something new. People who are used Bootstrap before, because it was good when it was developed, because we did not have CSS Grid and it made a lot of things easier. But today we don't need it anymore, because since which year? No, since at least Edge 16, but also 12 was not bad in it. Even Internet Explorer 10, Microsoft was inventing the grid system. We can use grid. So this is really a long time, and today there's actually no need for the grid of frameworks anymore. But frameworks are not only coming with the grid, but with a lot of other cool features. We know they look nice because we see them every day all over the web, which is a little bit boring for everybody who's working in such a creative surrounding with designers and things like this. Here I'm giving some examples. You will get the slides as a PDF later, so you can visit all these links. And I would like to ask you, just try them out there. Just a few examples, and use the search engine you like and go for it, and you will find many, many cool things you can use for your own web page. It's not just, they are not coming only with a framework. The problem is when you use Bootstrap or any other framework, you stop looking, you're just taking what's there. And so all the web pages somehow look equal, the same. So, Bootstrap comes with a documentation. This is an argument I hear quite often, but all the free techniques, all these standards, all they come with a specification. Nothing is better documented than CSS, HTML. And if this is a little bit difficult to understand, we were talking about this earlier in the last talk, then use all the free tutorials, videos and things like this today, webinars, to let somebody tell you how to use it. I don't think that there is not enough documentation for the official standardized languages like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and so on. Yeah, if you know how to work with Bootstrap, without Bootstrap, if you want to know how to work without Bootstrap, you actually have to know HTML and CSS, JavaScript, but these things you cannot avoid. Even when you're working with Bootstrap, you need these things. And the problem is that maybe you have already solutions with Bootstrap you would like to work with later instead of making your own things. But making your own things is, in my opinion, always possible because you don't have to develop your own framework completely. It's more like a tool set. And you're putting things in a toolbox and all the developers can take it out and just one part of it, like a screwdriver or a hammer or whatever. And when you're going with a framework, you're all the time carrying the whole toolbox with you. So if you're writing reusable code and put it, for example, into a Git repository where everybody can take whatever he wants or just flat files, whatever you like, then you end up with a lot of websites which have only these things inside which are really necessary, and they are much smaller, faster, and the code is much cleaner. And you have, I can promise you, you don't need to make this in one day. You're just starting with the things that are simple and, for example, a pagination or something small, and you're putting it in, and from this day, everybody in your company can reuse it. And for this one component, you don't need the framework anymore. And sooner or later, you won't need the whole framework anymore. Yeah. What impact has this way to work on teams? CSS became complex. Even people who are talking about CSS are admitting that they don't know the whole standard completely. It's just too much. So specialization makes sense. We have developers, front-end developers and back-end developers, but actually today front-end developers are very similar work to do like back-end developers because they are normally programmers. And I think that this is a mistake because if you have one specialized in HTML, CSS, and only CSS is already complex enough, in accessibility, of course, in search engine optimization, what you can do on page and things like this. There are so much things to know that it absolutely makes sense if you have people who are specialized in this area that cannot write any program, not JavaScript, not anything else. And if you're separating the concerns strictly, this minimizes dependencies. And I mean not dependencies in codes, I mean dependencies between people who are working. Because if I give an HTML to developers, I'm saving it in the file system or putting it in a Git repository or whatever, everybody can work and make their output into an HTML file just by taking these things I was putting somewhere. Even if I'm ill, even if I'm on vacation, and when I'm coming back, I'm putting the layout on it. Because this is the idea. The HTML output and the presentation is completely separated from each other. So also the people can work independently from each other. And yeah, full stack developers are a cheap compromise. And this is not against the people who are doing this, because they really have to learn a lot. But already in this one single thing, you can see that they cannot know everything. This is just impossible. And they don't even have, do not only need to know CSS and HTML and accessibility and SEO and JavaScript. They also have to deal with more and more software stacks like Node.js, Angular, and you probably heard of all these things. And we end up with people that are using all these things, but don't really master any of it. There are people who are specialized on some part of it, but this altogether is just too much to know everything about this. So especially for developers, full stack is a trap, because on the other hand, you will never keep up with everything you have to learn. And maybe you are feeling sometimes a little bit frustrated even about this. And on the other hand, you're becoming exchangeable. So this is really for you as a person, as a worker, it's not a good thing. And the better websites, of course, you're getting with this specialization. And one last thing, a front-end developer don't has to be more expensive as full stack developer. And if you are not a really small company agency, then you have to work with full stack developers, because you cannot afford a specialist for every little thing. But if there are at least 10 developers, one of them should deal only with CSS, HTML, accessibility, and things like this. And the output would be much, much better. So for me personally, there's this red line between front end and programming. This is how I make the difference between these two groups. Now, let's see an example how this could look like. Here's my editor. And here we have a form. It's quite a big form with a lot of fields. And as you can see here, I'm always putting an label and an input. No, let's start with this. The label is always the container for input and for the description. This is for accessibility reasons made like this. And this is all the HTML I need. And because I know I am getting many, many different designs, and very often I have to style radio elements different than, let's say, what we have later, input, normal input, text inputs, or text areas and other things. I need a few containers, like radio container, checkbox container, text area container, submit container for submit buttons and things like this. Just one little example, a submit button very often has to be on the right side, where everything else has to be on the left side. And with this, I can say already in my CSS, everything that has the class submit container should be on the right side, and I'm done. And this will work for every single form I'm using. And if the designer one day decides that it should be on the left, then it's just one place, one word I have to change in the CSS. And instead of right, there should be left, and everything is already done. So I'm showing this because this is not complicated. We have always the same little molecule. You're saying this in atomic design, and all these things are really easy to understand. There's not a lot of things to learn, and it's just long because I have a lot of inputs here. And we have a look now at the output. And this is what this form is looking like. So we have really a lot of fields in here. And make this smaller, and you will see that this is a complex form with a lot of things next to each other, and it's completely responsive. Everything is staying in the viewport, in the visible area here. The layout is changing. If there's not enough space, things are standing under each other, not next to each other anymore. And this all is happening with really little CSS, which we can find here. Forms. This is starting here, and this is already just for the color of the buttons and things like this. All the layout is happening in some parts here. And where it ends, let me see, that was about line 200. No, this was too small. This was just some general things. Form styling here. It starts at 746 and it ends here already. Here's main content area. So this is about 200 lines of code. And this is already main search, even less. And this really is not a lot. And this magic, like I call it, it's more or less happening here and with this grid layout, which we were talking about last week. I think the layout itself, if here are all colors and margins and everything, just putting things next to each other, maybe is 50 lines of code. Just to compare it in Bootstrap, this would be much, much more. And all what the developers that are not front-end developers but back-end developers have to know is that I need these classes: select container, if there are select boxes in it, input container for normal inputs. If they want to have a very long input, they must remember long input.
Mark, there's a question.
Yeah.
Or starts with a comment. I see a lot of prefixes in your CSS. Do we still need those in 2020? I thought not. In brackets, browser prefixes.
Yeah, that's not such a lot. These are, let me see. I'm using here custom properties for these people who know what it is. It's called CSS variables, and they are not supported by all browsers. So for these things, I think you need them. And here I was doing something fancy with the help from a colleague. This makes that I take in consideration that sometimes there is a scroll bar and sometimes not, and I don't want the layout to flicker. And so this is actually something nice to have. This is not even necessary. This, once again, this 10-15 lines is just, it's not about the layout. Once again, this is just making things a little bit nicer. Here, actually we have, but if I'm scrolling a little bit else, you see there are really not a lot of prefixes. This was just by accident one place where it was. Actually, really little need of this.
Is it good practice to have 1,000 lines CSS? Shouldn't you split this in multiple files for your own sanity?
I think this is depending on the way you work. I like very much to have everything in because I like to navigate in here like you've seen before. I'm just writing forms here and I'm jumping to the place where I'm styling all the forms. I like this very much, and I know other people like to split it up, have a lot of different files. What I was putting together here is only the output. Actually, I'm working with SASS, and there I have a few more files, but not much. You can make this really tiny pieces, but actually I like to have bigger files and navigate in them by using the search feature of the editor. This is just about what you prefer while working. The output always should be one file, because we have only one HTTP request and it should be minimized and so on. So yeah, it's just for organizing your work. Okay. So there are more features. For example, you can put in here one thing that I wanted to show you quickly, and there are a lot of features like this, and the good thing is you can easily understand it. If you can write this in your own language or in English, which I prefer, but if I remove this compact form class, the form is already looking completely different because you have only one column. Compact form means that things are standing next to each other, and actually this layout is what's recommended because it's easier to read. You need only one axis to fill out. Everything is here on the left, which makes it easier for most people to use it. But if you have a form with so many inputs, we are getting the feedback. This is too much scrolling. I want to have more on my screen. So maybe you could make multiple columns, and actually it's possible with just this one class. And here you go, there are multiple columns. Of course, my CSS is written, so this is working. And so that the user can choose what he needs, he's getting a little JavaScript button here, and you can change the layout by himself, compact form or normal. So all this fancy stuff, putting things next to each other, actually are not really good. But if the user himself wants it, I'm giving him the possibility.
There's a question and comment from a viewer. Hello, you advise developers to become specialists, not to be full stack, but for freelance, don't you think it's economically dangerous to not to be a multi-techno? I think about a former Flash developer.
Yeah, good question. This very much depends, of course, of what you're doing and how good you are at it, and how much people need what you actually can do. You're right, if you were a Flash developer, it's a problem now. And yeah, as a freelancer, I think you must go a little bit more to the full stack, but I have my own solution for this. I'm working like I'm showing you everything here today, or if I'm saying I want to give something completely from my hand and do everything myself, I'm using a CMS. In my case, it's WordPress. I don't think that it makes a lot of sense than doing anything by hand anymore at all. And if you're doing this, there are plugins for complex forms and things which are making it possible to make shops and everything without programming anything at all anymore. But still, it's very helpful to use to know CSS. So, but this everybody has to decide himself. And we are living, our work is changing so fast, and we just have to adopt, and we know this, that there is disruption which is happening because of digitalization, and yeah, we have to adopt to this, and we must change what we are doing a lot when we are working with computers. Imagine of people who were developing for Atari or Amiga before. Of course, they all had to learn new things.
Manuel agrees with you. It's not the person who originally asked the question, but we have one person who's agreeing and saying, I don't believe in full stack. Also, you're more likely to be paid better when you're a specialist. He's been focusing on Apple technologies since 2008 and always had work, but yeah, knowing other stuffs like CSS and HTML is useful. You can't fully escape the web, also on iOS.
Yeah.
And there's another question, comment from Eve. It's a little bit confusing. Maybe you can specify what you mean, or maybe we can ask. I'm asking the viewer. Maybe.
Yeah. Okay.
So we can. So I can address.
Maybe I
the
will
question
go on.
To you again.
We are nearly
Yes.
done, and we are a little bit over the time. If we have the time, I would like to go on a little bit. Is this okay? Okay.
I think so. Yes.
Anyway, I will answer this question later. Yeah, we will skip this. I prepared an example of a form generated by Typo3 using Bootstrap, and I just want to say that the page was 6 times the size of what I was providing, and the problem is 6 times means not just only the code, the elements, but this is including everything, even the content. And although the content not changed, my version was 6 times smaller. So there is really an impact that you can see. And it's funny, I was making this comparison only once before, and this was when I was first in my life using CSS and replacing a table layout with CSS, and it was the same ratio this time. So size matters. If there are no questions, I would like to show one really nice thing, because one thing which is really nice in, oh, he changed it. Doesn't matter. We are not going there. I'm going just showing the code, which is really nice if you can work with things like button small, button gray, and an ordinary button, just a button. And I don't want to write this in my HTML. And here you can see that in the HTML, there's always only button type submit, nothing else. You can even remove this because this is actually the default. It will work even without this. So with this little HTML, you can, I need this here for, but actually for the styling, but you don't need it for being a button, a submit button. So what I'm doing here is I'm using SASS, especially for giving these names that I can understand. I immediately understand what they are doing. Here's a small button, here's a gray button, this is this one, and it does not appear here because these are extents in SASS. And I'm saying a button in the header should look like a button and be small. And the button in the main area should be just a button. This is the green one. And the button in the footer should be like a button and it should be gray. And of course, I could also write the small into here just to prove it. Last thing to do today, but I think this is really cool. So you can name things the way that are easy to understand if you're using a little bit of SASS. It's not necessary to learn everything you can do with SASS for making things like this, but this way you can keep your HTML free of presentational markup. You don't need anything like big button, small button, gray button in your HTML, but still you can use these names while developing, and it's making things easier. Okay, actually, I think I'm done.
Manu was asking about the percentage in the CSS. He's saying SCSS, I guess.
Yeah, this is SASS syntax. I don't like to use really a lot of SASS because the output is a little bit less nice, but doesn't matter. I'm using SASS, and use it if you want it, then use it your way. I'm using it actually for things like this, to give things names I can understand without even reading any and writing any documentation. And I use SASS extensively to work with variables. So I can easily make a new color scheme if necessary. Maybe very often we have websites when everything looks the same like our standard design, but just has different colors. And if you're working with things like this, variables are really a nice way to change it quickly.
There's another comment, but IMHO, the naming should not reference the layout. Brackets, gray, small.
Why not? The thing is, it's much easier to understand. The thing is, you're not putting this in your HTML. Your HTML should be free of this presentational things. And just imagine you have some buttons there from the designer, a gray, a green, a blue, a yellow, a red, and you can use them so easily, and it never appears in the actual result of the HTML, not even in the CSS, because all these things after pre-processing are not appearing in the CSS. In the CSS you will have, I don't know, can you show this here? But the CSS output would be like all the things I was defining here will be just written here, and you won't even see this presentational names anymore. I really encourage you try this thing out, and I was going a little bit fast over it because the guy I took this idea from redesigned its homepage. So here are all his talks, and this is the best of two worlds. And CSS preprocessors for the best of both worlds. Here's the talk on YouTube, and I really recommend you watching this. I don't have the time to explain this here anymore. This is really nice idea, and he's in detail explaining this technique and why it is not bad to use names like this in your SASS.
Thank you. There might have been a misunderstanding, and well, since we are over the time, I would say we'll take this over, because we were thinking of doing the consultation called Sprechstunde in German, and where we will where you will answer questions. Mark, maybe we're hopefully setting this up soon, and then you can ask all the questions. And yeah, should I close it now?
Yeah, I'm finished. This is just a summary. I really recommend do not replace the simplicity what we can have with complex constructs. Actually, it does not make things better. I was working maybe this last thing for a company, or I wanted to work, and it was so many things to learn. As you see, I know SASS, but only understanding the way they are working with SASS, their concept makes it difficult for freelancers to get into these agencies. On the other hand, they have difficulties to find people who can work with their own stack of software and what they are using. This is not always good. They are all promising to make things easier, but just one thing you should keep in mind. If you have many different software tools, frameworks for CSS, for JavaScript, and so on, and you're not touching it for 1 year, and then the customer is saying, and he wants to change something, you can change it only if you are using a newer version of one of these things. Maybe this whole construct will not work together anymore. This is sometimes easier to put things together, but it can be really a headache to make changes after you were not touching it for, let's say, a year.